1 of Code Club. This week, we're going to go over some of the basics of Scratch and how to use it. Look at some simple code to get an idea of the power of Scratch to create games or stories or interactive art. Open up another browser window and log into Scratch so that you can follow along with the video. Have fun and let's start coding. This is the screen you'll see when you first log into Scratch. And the main buttons you'll want to be using are the Create button and the one that has your username in it where you can drop it down and look at your stuff. And this is where all the programs that you create are going to show up. There's a couple of other buttons up in this top bar that you might want to know what they do. So this one takes you to My Stuff. It's the same as going here and going to My Stuff. This one is Messages. So Scratch has a built-in messaging system where you can comment on other people's projects and things like that. So once you start getting more into looking at other people's projects, you might want to go there and look at your messages or message somebody else. Over on this side of the search bar, we have an About button, which just takes you to some text information about Scratch. It's not really very interesting for you guys, so you can just ignore that. Ideas takes you to a page that has a whole bunch of tutorials about how to build things. So how to animate your name, how to animate a character. If you're looking for ideas for things to do, this is a great place to get ideas. The Explore button takes you to a list of things that people have created with Scratch. So here's one called Pen Platformer. Looks like it's probably going to be a game. Let's wait for it to load up here. Just take a second. And we'll click this green button and that'll let us do whatever it is. So yeah, there's a button that says play. They've got some nice music here. They have some notes over here that tell you how to play. So it says use arrow keys to move. So I'm jumping around here. That thing made me bounce. So this is a game that somebody created. If you get good enough with Scratch, you can do something like this too. The last thing I want to show you is this search bar at the top of the page. And in here you can type the name of a project or the name of a person or just something you're looking for and it'll show up. So for example, if I type in Pen Platformer here and hit enter, that game we just played shows up. But if you're looking for, a lot of people like to play a bottle flip game. So if you type in bottle flip, hit enter, there's a bunch of bottle flip games you could play. The other thing you can do is search for people. So if you type my name in here, Matt Beachy, it's going to show you all of the projects that I created. And what I'd like you to do here is click on my username, Matt Beachy, and that'll bring you to my profile page. And when you see it, you should see a follow button on there. And if you click that, you'll get updates every time I add new projects or anything like that. So it's a good idea to follow me. That way you can see what I'm doing. And as we get further along into the classes and I have some games and stuff like that I created, you can take a look at them and look at the code behind them to see what's going on. Okay, enough about this top bar stuff. Let's go in and actually start doing some coding. To do that, you click the Create button. And this is going to load up the Scratch editor. It takes a couple of seconds for it to create your project, and it'll load up the Scratch window. Now that we're in a project, there's a few key areas you need to know before you can start coding. First of all, this white area over here with ScratchCAD in it is called the stage. And as we add new things to our program, this is where we're going to add them. Next is this big open area in the middle, and this is the script area. Anytime we want to add code to our program, this is where we're going to add the code, and that's what I'm doing now if you notice me dragging these little blocks onto here. Over on the left here we have the blocks panel, and that's where all the blocks of code that can make up your program live. And figuring out what a lot of these do is going to be what we cover over the next 6 weeks of this class. Down underneath the stage, we have the sprite list area and the stage changing area. And these allow you to change things about your sprites or add new sprites and allow you to change things about the stage. We'll go over what to do with each of these later. Right up above the blocks panel, we have some tabs for code, costumes, and sounds. And we'll go over what each of these things does later, but just know that this lets you change to costume editing, sound editing, or code editing depending on what you want to do with your program. Finally, up at the top, we have a file and an edit menu and a place here where you can give your project a title. So you can put a name in, and then go to the File menu and do Save Now, and now you have a saved project. And this is what lets you share your project with other people or come back later and work on something over a long period of time. You want to be able to save your projects. And Scratch will save it for you occasionally, but it's always a good idea before you go away from your page, go to the File menu and click Save Now, just to make sure that your project gets saved. Now that we have those basics out of the way, we can start talking about the components that actually make up the project that will become your game or your story or whatever you want to create. The first thing you'll notice is every time you start a new project, which I'm going to do now, go to File, New, and it'll create a new project for us. It always comes up with the Scratchcat here. And Scratchcat is called a sprite. Not like the soda, the sprite is kind of the visual representation of what you want your program to do. So for example, if I wanted Scratchcat to walk across the screen, I need a sprite to represent the Scratchcat. If I want to have an airplane fly from the bottom corner to the top corner, I need a sprite for an airplane. And you can add as many sprites to your program as you want, and each sprite can have its own code and its own images so that they all look and do different things. You can add new sprites to your program by hovering over this little choose a sprite icon down here. It looks kind of like a cat face with a plus sign by it. And this lets you choose a sprite from a gallery that is already on Scratch. You can paint your own. You can have it give you a surprise one, or you can upload an image to be your sprite. I'm just going to choose surprise and it'll give me a surprise one. So it gives me this F letter as my surprise sprite. I'm just going to move it out of the way so it's not hovering over Scratchcat right now. Now I have two sprites on my stage, and you can change information and code depending on which sprite you have chosen down here in the sprite list. So you can see right now sprite 1, which is the Scratchcat, is lit up, but if I click over onto the F, now that one is lit up and I can change its information. And the first thing you'll notice is that the sprite name is different. This one is named Block F. This one is named Sprite 1. And I'm going to change it real quick to say Scratchcat. That way we can tell for sure what it is. Sprite 1 isn't a very descriptive name. And it changes it down here. So now when we switch, it says Block F or Scratchcat. When we start adding code to our sprites, the code is also attached to individual sprites, not all your sprites. So for example, if I want to make Scratchcat walk across the screen, I can add motion that says move 10 steps. I'm going to change it to be 100 steps instead, just so it's very obvious what's happening. And this code is only in the Scratchcat sprite. It is not in the Block F sprite. So on Block F, maybe I'll add something for turn 15 degrees, but I'll change it to be 90 degrees. That way it's very obvious what's happening. So now we have in the Scratchcat, move 100 steps. In Block F, we have turn 90 degrees. Let's see what happens when we run our program. The way you run your program is right up here. There's a little green flag and a red stop sign. If you hit the green flag, it says go. That's what runs your program. Scratchcat moved 100 steps and the F turned 90 degrees, just like we wanted. We'll talk a lot more about adding code to sprites in the future. For now, I'm going to start a new project so I can go move on to the next concept. One thing that's cool about the sprites in Scratch is that they can have different costumes. So we have a stage, and then we have sprites, which are kind of like actors, and the actors can have different costumes. And you access that by going to the Costumes tab up here. There's all sorts of tools in the Costume window for adding and editing costumes. We're not going to talk too much about those now. We're just going to talk about how to change the costumes in your code. So you see here, the Scratchcat already has two costumes, Costume 1 and Costume 2. And basically, they make it kind of look like Scratchcat is running if you go through them fast enough. Now we're going to switch back to the Code tab and add some code to our program that makes it look like the Scratchcat is running by switching through those two costumes. The first thing we need to do is go to the Events category and add a When Green Flag Clicked block. And what the When Green Flag Clicked does is it says any code that's attached to me is what should run when you click the green flag to start your program. So for most of your sprites, it's pretty important that you have the When Green Flag Clicked block and some code underneath it, otherwise your sprite isn't going to do anything when you click that green flag. The next thing we're going to do is go to the Motion category, and this is things that make your sprite move around. We're going to add a Go to X0, Y0, and that's going to make Scratchcat move to the middle of the screen. In Scratch, 0, 0 means the middle of the screen. If you move around from there, you can see X changes if I move him left and right, and Y changes if I move him up and down. But we want him to go to 0, 0. The other thing we want to do right away is make sure that the costume that Scratchcat is using is Costume 1. So we'll go to the Looks category, and we'll say Switch to Costume 1. And you can kind of see when you add it, it clicks up to the bottom, and that's what we want to happen so that it kind of runs all in a row. It'll say when the green flag is clicked, go to X0, Y0, and switch costume to Costume 1. An important thing to notice here is if you add code outside where it's not snapped on like this code won't run when the green flag is clicked. You have to make sure your code is snapped on to the bottom. And if you have code that you don't want, like we don't want Scratchcat to say hello right now, if you want to delete it, you can just drag it back over here and let go, and that kind of deletes it from the code area. But you could always add it back later if you want to. The next thing we want to do is make Scratchcat continually switch between the costumes to make him look like he's walking. So if we go into this control category, these are things that let you do some advanced things with your code, like repeating code or choosing things with an if-then, or waiting until something happens, or repeating until something happens. We'll talk a lot more about these in the future, but for now I'm just going to choose the repeat number of times. And right now it says 10. I'm going to choose 20 here just to up it a little bit. So this is going to make whatever's code in here repeat 20 times. So what do we want Scratchcat to do 20 times? We want him to switch between costume 2 and costume 1. So let's go back to the looks category. We have switch 2. And if you notice, there's a little arrow here. I can drop it down and I can choose costume 2 instead. So now that will switch him to costume 2. And then I can add the same block right underneath it. It says switch costume to costume 1. So this is going to have him switch to costume 2, then to costume 1, and it'll repeat those 2 lines of code 20 times. Let's run this code and see what happens if it makes Scratchcat look like he's walking. So we'll click the green button, and our code runs, and nothing happens. What did we do wrong? Well, the problem is this code runs really, really fast. It's actually switching 20 times between costume 2 and costume 1, but we can't see it because the code runs so fast. How do we fix this problem? Maybe if you notice, back in the control section, there was a thing that said wait 1 second. And this actually lets you choose any number of seconds you want. We can add a couple of these in here. So we'll throw one in between switch costume 2, switch costume 1. If you notice, I was able to drag it in and it dropped right between the two of them and snapped in place there. And I'm going to change it down to a half a second. So a half is 0.5. I'm going to change it to wait 0.5 seconds. So now I'll switch to costume 2, wait a half a second, and then switch to costume 1. Well, we need another one of those because otherwise we won't be able to see costume 1 because it'll switch back too fast. So we'll add one here as well. So it's going to repeat 20 times, switch to costume 2, wait a half a second, switch to costume 1, wait another half a second. Now we have these waits in there. Let's run our code again and see what happens. Now it kind of looks like Scratchcat is walking, right? His legs are moving a little bit, his arms are moving. That kind of looks like Scratchcat is walking. The problem is he's still not actually moving across the screen. We also need some code in there to make him move across the screen. As you might have guessed, to make him move, we need to go back to the motion category. And the easiest thing to do is going to be an add a move 10 steps. And since we want it to repeat, we need to make sure that we get it inside of our repeat. So we'll have it repeat 20 times, switching the costume, waiting, switching the costume, waiting, and then moving 10 steps. So that means as it loops through, it's going to move him 200 steps because it's going to repeat 20 times, and 20 times 10 is 200. So let's click on the green flag and see what happens. So his arms and legs are swinging, looks like he's moving, and he's actually moving across the screen just like we want. Maybe a little slower than we actually want, but for a first program, this is pretty good. One other thing I wanted to show you before we move on from working with sprites this week is if for some reason you wanted an exact copy of this Scratchcat sprite, you could right click on it down in the sprite list window here and you get a little menu that says duplicate, delete, or export. So if you click duplicate, that's going to create a new Scratchcat sprite that looks exactly the same as your first one, except it's got a different name. This one is Sprite 2 and this one is Sprite 1, and it put it in the center of the window instead of putting it up where the other one is. And then once you do that, everything about it is exactly the same until you start changing it. So, for example, if we want this Scratchcat, our original one, to start at 0, 0, maybe we want this one to start at 0 and then have Y be 50. So that's going to move him up a little higher on the screen. And for Sprite 1, he's at 0, 0, it's a little lower. So now we have two that are a little bit offset from each other. The code looks different now, and because it was a duplicate, they started looking the same. But any code I change in here is going to make them a little bit different. So the other thing I'll do is I'll change Sprite 2. Instead of moving 10 steps, he's going to move 12 steps. And when I click run, he's going to run a little bit faster, and if this were a race, he would win the race. Let's click go and see what happens. So they're both running. If you notice, This one is Sprite 2, you can tell because it's a little bit higher, and he looks like he's running just a little bit faster because he's moving 12 steps instead of 10 steps. So you can duplicate a sprite, and when you duplicate it, it gets all the same costumes, all the same code, but once you start changing things, if you were to add new costumes to your duplicate or to your original, or change the code of your original or your duplicate, the code and the costumes are all going to be different because the changes you make don't move into the duplicate. They're completely different after you make the duplicate. I started a new project so that we can start talking about the stage area of your project. And if you notice, it changes things a little bit. The blocks that are available to you change, and this up here says backdrops instead of costumes. And what this does is it lets you change the stage to have different pictures and different code, and the code that runs in here is separate from the code that runs in your sprites. So if I switch to the backdrops tab, you can see there's one backdrop, it's just this white window, and there's all sorts of stuff in here where we can edit it. But for now, I'm just going to add a surprise backdrop. And it looks like this refrigerator thing, and so you can see Scratch Cat is standing on top of the refrigerator part. And I'll add one more surprise backdrop, which looks like this library thing. So now I have 3 backdrops. I'm going to go ahead and remove backdrop 1, and it works just like the sprite window down here. If I click this X, it's going to remove it. So now I have 2 backdrops, the refrigerator and this room, and if I change it, it looks like Scratch Cat is in a room or in a refrigerator. Just like with a sprite, you can add code to a backdrop that affects what it looks like. So real quick, we'll add the when clicked event. We'll go back to looks, and we'll say switch backdrop to refrigerator, switch backdrop to room 1, and I'll add a quick wait in there so that we stay on the refrigerator for 1 second, and then we stay on the room for 1 second. And we'll click play and see what happens. So we're on refrigerator, and then we're on the room. It's a real simple program, but it shows you can add code to your backdrop and do stuff with your backdrop to make it change. We'll talk more about some stuff we can do with backdrop code in the future. I wanted to show you really quick a real program that I'm using, and it's the program that's the introduction to the Code Club video. So let me just play it real quick so you can see what it does. It says Ardmore, School, Code Club, and then with Mr. Beachy. So this is code that I wrote in Scratch, and if you notice, there's a bunch of different sprites down here that all have a little bit different code in them. There's a backdrop that's bright red. If I look on it, you can see it here. There's not any code in the backdrop, but that's okay. But this is kind of like what a real program would look like. There's a lot of different sprites and a lot of different code depending on what the sprite looks like. There's a bunch of blocks in here that you haven't seen yet, like when I receive and broadcast, start sound, show, hide. We'll talk about all this stuff in the future, but just you can look at something like this and get an idea for what a real program looks like. One of the great features about Scratch is that you can share your projects with other people, and you can look at other people's projects and do what they call remixing them and change the code in the program to do something that you want it to do. I have kind of an empty project here, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like to share a project. Right up here in the top, there's a share button. You click it, and it says your project is now shared. And this lets other people see your program. You can add instructions for how to use it here. You can add notes and credits. A lot of times if you were to find an image or some music or something out on the web and you wanted to use them in your program, you would give people credits here. Or if you remix somebody else's program, you can make sure to give them credit for the remix that you did. If you want to remix somebody else's program, and I'm just going to go to Explore so I can find a random program. So here's this one called Gravity Run. Somebody else made this program. It's going to pop it up here. I can click this remix button. What this does is going to make an exact copy of this program and make it something that I can edit. So I can see all the sprites. I can see all the code over here. There's tons of code in this program. And now I can go in and change things to do what I want to do. So, for example, here's the Scratch Cat. They're using a Scratch Cat that looks like this. If I wanted to make him a different color, I could go in and edit this Scratch Cat. So he's blue right now. I just drag this down here. Now he has a red head. Now I'd have to go into each of these individual costumes on the sprite and change it to have a red head on all of them. But it's something that you can do to change it. You can also go in and, for example, now I don't know what any of this code does yet. They'll say when I receive message 1. So here's when the green flag is clicked, it says switch to costume 1. Maybe instead I want it to switch to costume 8. I don't know. But you can start changing the code as well. And any changes you make here don't affect the original person's program. They only affect the one that you made. If you go back into your profile, go to your My Stuff, you can kind of see everything that you have, all the programs that you have in your profile. And you can see the ones you have shared, and I actually want to go in and unshare this one that I just made because nobody needs to see that. It's just a garbage thing. And you can see all your unshared ones. So for example, this Gravity Run Remix, I don't actually want this. I'm just going to delete it. So you can do some management of your projects in here. And the other thing that's cool is when you're looking at your code, if you have something that's shared, it'll give you some statistics about how many people have looked at it, how many people have remixed it, who's loved it, who's saved it, if anybody's commented on it. I think, yeah, see, like this snake program here, I've had a couple people comment on. So it'll show you all sorts of interesting things about the code that you've made. But the important part is if you have something you don't want to share anymore, you can unshare it. So always remember that when you share something, it's not permanent. The only thing that would be permanent is if somebody remixed it, they have a copy of it in their profile forever. That's it for week 1 of Code Club. I hope you enjoyed it. Go out and do some coding on your own. Have some fun, be creative, and we'll see you next week.